A human skull can feel like an empty vault, all bone and silence until you understand that inside it, the brain performs a feat that should not be possible. It preserves yesterday's experience. Touch a hot stove once, and your body remembers the lesson before you even decide to be careful. That memory lives not in the skull, but in networks of living tissue that can change and yet remain themselves. The mystery begins with a simple question that neuroscience still respects. How does electrical activity become something that lasts? What we can prove is surprisingly precise. The brain does not store memories like a photograph in a drawer. It builds them through connections between neuron synapses that strengthen or weaken with use. When you learn a melody or recognize a face, groups of neurons fire together, and the pattern becomes more likely to reappear. Experiments show that damage to certain regions can remove specific kinds of memory, like losing the ability to form new experiences while older skills remain. That means memory is not one single box, but a distributed process dependent on circuits, chemistry, and time. Even more, the brain carries the signature of learning. When synaptic connections are modified, information can be reactivated later, during sleep or quiet rest. This reactivation helps consolidate experiences, turning fleeting activity into a more stable representation. Damage to pathways involved in consolidation doesn't just erase facts. It changes how experiences become usable. In other words, the brain remembers by rewriting how it talks to itself repeatedly until the new pattern can be retrieved. But here's the part that refuses to sit still. Memory is not only storage. It is interpretation. The brain edits, fills gaps, and sometimes reconstructs events that never happened, yet the confidence feels identical to genuine recollection. So if memories can be altered by stress, expectation, and context, what exactly counts as the original experience? And why does the feeling of certainty persist even when the details drift? We also know memory is layered. Some traces act like habits automatic, learned by repetition, while others depend on conscious recall and a careful sense of when and where. This suggests multiple systems operating at once, each with its own rules for updating and failing. The brain may be able to protect what matters, while discarding what it predicts will be irrelevant. Yet that raises another unresolved challenge. How does the brain decide what deserves permanence and what can be safely forgotten? And then there's the skull itself, the solid boundary that should trap the past like an artifact in stone. Instead, memory is dynamic, governed by ongoing neural activity and constant microscopic remodeling. So the shouldn't remember skull does something stranger than holding records. It hosts a process that can recreate experience from internal patterns. The next step isn't just asking where memories are stored, but how the brain translates chaos signals, synapses, and noise into a coherent story you can live inside. In the sealed quiet of sleep, the brain runs a nightly audit. Hunger and sleep are not simple wants, but coordinated control systems that decide what gets your attention when your body gets to rest, and which memories get tagged for use tomorrow. And that matters for daily life, because ancient people lived where food was uncertain and nights were often the safest refuge they owned. We know from modern neuroscience that sleep regulates more than recovery. It organizes learning, dampens some threats, and strengthens useful patterns while allowing others to fade. When sleep is disrupted, the brain becomes biased toward immediate reward, and small irritations feel louder. Translate that into an archaeological setting. A family sleeping in a crowded space, exposed to cold, smoke, or intermittent danger, would not just lose sleep. Their planning would shift, their impulses would sharpen, and their routines would harden into whatever kept life predictable. Hunger works in a similar way, but with a different clock. Signals from the body rise and fall, steering the brain towards searching, prioritizing, and conserving energy. Point 1. 5. Importantly, cravings are not purely mechanical. They're contextual. Smell, sight, ritual, and even the timing of past meals can cue the brain to anticipate what might come. That means behavior can become habitual long before anyone thinks about it. Gatherers returning to familiar routes. Households aligning cooking to predictable moments. Children learning the rhythm of when food appears. But how much of this can we claim for the past? Texts and tool patterns hint at rhythms. Meal preparation storage, seasonal migrations, and sleeping arrangements. Yet the brain's exact wiring cannot be excavated. We infer control strategies from recurring artifacts. Hearth placement suggesting where heat and cooking clustered. Grinding stones implying repeated processing. Storage vessels revealing intervals of plenty and scarcity. The evidence points to cycles, but it can't show us the internal feeling of wanting, the moment a decision flips from wait to search, or how quickly stress reshaped priorities. Still, the direction is persuasive. Stable habits reduce cognitive load, while chronic threat and deprivation tighten the brain's focus onto survival. So when we see a community with consistent daily routines, or with sudden shifts in diet after environmental stress, we're not just watching culture. We're watching brains try to survive with limited certainty, using memory, expectation, and bodily signals as tools. And if sleep and hunger can bend attention and learning in modern brains, what unseen pressures were shaping the choices behind every routine we're still finding traces of, especially when the night was uncertain and the pantry was never guaranteed. 2 inches a sealed tomb. We can't carve thoughts into stone, but the brain leaves footprints anyway. The same mind that turns hunger into action also turns scattered clues into a plan. And it does so through perception, learning, and prediction working as a single system. When ancient people walked to a familiar spring, their senses didn't just report water. The brain stitched together sight, sound, temperature, and the remembered slope of the ground, then compared it to expectations. That prediction matters because engineering depends on it. You don't build well by reacting to surprises. You build by anticipating what should happen when a stone is placed, when a wall catches wind, when a roof sheds rain. The temple was not only a monument, it was a strategy the brain could repeat, an environment designed to make future decisions easier. Learning is the second engine. Practice strengthens pathways, turning complex sequences into routines that require less effort. A potter who shapes clay the same way each day is using memory to reduce uncertainty. And a builder who checks measurements by feel is doing the same, just with different senses. Stress disrupts that learning too. In modern laboratories, sleep loss and chronic threat tighten attention and narrow planning, pushing people towards short-term fixes. If that is true today, then any architecture that remains stable across generations quietly suggests brains that had time to teach, correct, and refine. Planning is where perception and learning become architecture. The brain doesn't simply see measurements. It simulates outcomes. A load-bearing wall asks a question in the mind. Will the center hold? Will the supports fail? Will the structure survive the next rainy season? We can't witness that internal rehearsal, but we can test whether communities behaved like planners by looking for consistent solutions. Repeated foundation techniques, standardized angles, and carefully chosen materials show more than taste. They reveal planning depth steps that happen before the first stone is lifted. Archaeology detects these cognitive steps indirectly, like reading weather from dried riverbeds. Tool where patterns can show whether tasks were learned through repetition or performed in bursts of improvisation. Spatial organization where work areas sit relative to water, fuel, and storage implies who expected what and when. If hearts align with cooking cycles and refuse ends up in predictable zones. The brain that managed time is leaving a map behind. Even changes over time tell a story. A sudden shift in construction style can reflect new constraints hitting perception and memory. The way a community's training can be rewritten by famine, conflict, or relocation. So the method is not mystical. It's causal reasoning. If brains optimize certainty, then remains should show the patterns of optimization, economies of movement, stable layouts, and construction decisions that minimize risk while maximizing throughput. And if the living brain uses hunger, fatigue, and threat as signals to reweight priorities, then architecture and artifact distribution become records of that reweighting. What looks like just buildings may actually be the visible trace of invisible rehearsals, question after question, built into walls that expected tomorrow to arrive. Inside the skull, meaning ISNT stored like a bookmark. It's assembled in real time, stitched from sensation, expectation, and a need to make the world manageable. A brain that can predict beats a brain that merely reacts. So it is always trying to turn noise into narrative. This happened because of that, and we responded because we knew what it meant. That urge to link events in a story can be socially useful. 2. Because shared stories feel like shared reality, an invisible bond you can carry without a contract. Rituals exploit this mechanism, not as magic, but as rehearsal. When a community repeats a sequence, offer, phrase, symbol, gesture, multiple minds synchronize their attention, emotions, and timing. The brain learns faster when it can anticipate the next cue. And it learns trust when many others anticipate the same cue with you. That is why iconography matters. Images are compact predictions. A repeated sign is a shortcut that says, in effect, remember what you're supposed to feel and what you're supposed to do next. You can see the pattern in burials where grave goods mirror the social roles people expected to continue. The meanings are not just decorative. They are cues engineered for group memory. At the same time, we have to separate what is proven from what is speculation. Neuroscience can show general pathways, how attention locks on a meaning, how prediction strengthens learning, how emotion tags recollections. But archaeology cannot read specific thoughts out of stone. When we interpret a carved face as a deity or a recurring symbol as a ritual script, we're building a model, not a measurement. The safest claims follow constraints. A symbol appears repeatedly in consistent contexts across lifetimes, suggesting shared norms powerful enough to outlast individual taste. So how does story connect to belief that seems to violate common sense? The answer may lie in a brain's preference for explanatory coherence. If a storm ruins crops, a narrative that includes agency, divine displeasure, ancestral obligation. Ritual correction turns helpless chaos into something actionable. Even the ordering of steps matters, because the brain feels relief when uncertainty is managed. When communities invest labor into aligned spaces, standardized offerings, and durable images, they're not only honoring the sacred, they're training themselves to keep interpreting events the same way when fear and ambiguity rise. This is also where iconography becomes social architecture. Repetition in paint, metal, and carved surfaces can reduce the cost of coordination. You don't need to convince someone from scratch every time. You can point, and your pointing carries a tested interpretation that others have already rehearsed. That SY belief can spread without a single written lesson. The symbols function like a behavioral grammar the brain eagerly learns, but the unresolved tension remains. The same mechanisms that help people bond can also make them confident in stories that were never verified. And that's the question archaeology keeps bumping into as it dusts a surface clean. Are we seeing a window into shared prediction? Or are we glimpsing the mind's unstoppable tendency to invent meaning when evidence runs out? In the next part, we'll look at how specific ritual objects and their placements can narrow those possibilities, turning maybe into patterns we can test. So the brain doesn't just believe randomly. It builds a model that keeps life, legible patterns, repetition, and coherent explanations all make uncertainty easier to carry. When societies use symbols, shared rituals, and fixed spaces, they're doing something surprisingly practical, lowering confusion. So many minds can predict the same world and act together. Yet that same machinery can overreach, rewarding satisfying stories even when proof is thin. Next, we'll test that boundary with the artifacts themselves. If you want more, like and subscribe, and tell me which ancient ritual object you'd want decoded first.